She walked into the luxury car dealership in worn jeans and a plain white t-shirt, her presence quiet but purposeful. "Hi," she said with a calm smile. "I'm interested in one of your vehicles." The salesman barely concealed his contempt, giving her a once-over that dripped with judgment. "You might be in the wrong place," he said with a sneer, nodding toward the exit. "These cars start at $300,000. Laughter rippled from nearby staff. Customers turned to stare. Her cheeks flushed, but she said nothing, just turned and walked away. The next morning, a gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled up to the dealership's front entrance. The back door opened, and the same woman stepped out. Inside, Boston Luxury Motors sparkled with floor-to-ceiling glass and a fleet of dream cars, Porsche, Bentley, Aston Martin, Ferrari, all lined up like royalty. Every detail screamed prestige. Margaret Collins, Maggie, to those who knew her, stepped through the doors, her ponytail swaying behind her. She wore the same white tee, the same jeans, and a gentle confidence that didn't need designer labels. At 35, she'd built the Collins Foundation from the ground up, a non-profit that had changed the lives of thousands of children with disabilities. Long before she met her now husband, she was already a force for good, investing her education and heart into making the world better. Today she had one mission in mind, her sister, Caroline's 40th birthday. Caroline, who had bravely beaten breast cancer just last year, had always dreamed of owning a luxury car. Maggie wanted to make that dream come true. With a midnight blue coupe she had seen the day before, she could afford it easily. Between the success of her foundation and her personal investments, money wasn't a concern. But appearances? That was never Maggie's priority. Across the room, sales manager Blake Thompson spotted her. He adjusted his tie, straightened his navy jacket, and smirked. "This should be interesting," he muttered to a colleague. Before she could speak, a young salesman named Daniel greeted her with a smile. "Good morning. I'm Daniel. Is there a car you're interested in?" "I'd love to see that midnight blue coupe," Maggie said, pointing to the $285,000 limited edition Azure on display. Before Daniel could respond, Blake cut in. "Thanks, Daniel. I'll take it from here." He turned to Maggie, flashing a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" Maggie smiled calmly. "No, I'd really love to know more about that car." Blake's tone shifted, condescending now. "That model is a limited edition. Only 15 were made. It's for serious clients, by appointment only. Maybe I can direct you to our used car section. It's about 3 blocks east." She noticed the flicker of his eyes as they scanned her outfit, lingering on her scuffed sneakers. She was used to it. People rarely guessed that her lifestyle was a choice, that she found freedom in simplicity despite her wealth. "I understand," she said politely. "But I'd still like to learn more about that one." Blake sighed, already losing patience. Behind him, 2 salesmen exchanged smug glances. "Like I said," he replied, "appointments only. Our serious clients prefer a more private experience." At that moment, a couple dressed in designer clothes walked in. Blake lit up instantly. "Excuse me," he told Maggie, already walking away. "Daniel, give her a brochure or something." He strode toward the newcomers, arms outstretched. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington, what a pleasure." Daniel returned to Maggie, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm really sorry about that," he said softly. "Would you still like to hear about the Azure?" "I would, thank you," Maggie replied with grace. As Daniel enthusiastically began describing the car's features, Maggie watched Blake fawning over the Harringtons. He led them straight to the Azure, opening the door with dramatic flair. "This model usually has an 8-month wait," he said proudly, "but I've set one aside for special clients." Mrs. Harrington ran a hand over the leather seats. "It's beautiful," but I'm not sure about the color. We can absolutely discuss custom options, Blake replied. Just then, Maggie stepped quietly within earshot. Excuse me. I was actually hoping to inquire about purchasing this model, Maggie said calmly, her gaze steady as she pointed to the midnight blue coupe. Blake's expression tightened, his irritation barely masked. As I mentioned earlier, he said curtly, this vehicle is currently being shown to our other customers. He gestured toward the well-dressed couple, clearly expecting Maggie to step aside. Maybe you could come back another time, or, as I suggested, visit our used car section. The Harringtons glanced uncomfortably between Maggie and Blake, caught in the tension. I'm specifically interested in this car, Maggie replied, still composed. It's a birthday gift for my sister next month. Blake stepped away from the couple and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide the sharpness. Look, I get it. People like to come in and dream, but this is a professional environment. That car costs more than most people's homes. I've been patient, but you're disrupting a legitimate sale. Nearby, customers had begun to pause and watch the scene unfold. Daniel hovered at the edge of the group, clearly distressed. I'm prepared to make a cash purchase today, Maggie said evenly. Blake barked a short, disbelieving laugh that echoed across the glossy showroom floor. Heads turned. A cash purchase, he repeated, louder now, clearly aiming to shame her. This isn't a flea market. We're talking about a $250,000 vehicle. People who can afford these kinds of cars don't show up looking like... He gestured vaguely at her jeans and sneakers, his face twisting in disdain. Maggie felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from a slow, steady anger, not for herself. She'd endured this kind of judgment before, but for anyone who'd ever been dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's mold of success. I believe my money is as good as anyone else's, she said quietly. Blake stepped closer, his tone now openly condescending. Let me be clear, he said, voice sharp. You are wasting my time, and frankly, you're embarrassing yourself. If you want to have a serious discussion, come back dressed appropriately. Otherwise, please leave. The room had fallen silent. Even the Harringtons had stepped away from the car, visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding confrontation. That's when another voice entered the scene. Is there a problem here? The dealership's owner, Richard Mason, had emerged, drawn by the commotion. Blake immediately straightened his tie, trying to maintain control. No issue, sir, he said quickly. Just explaining to this lady that we require appointments for serious buyers. Richard took in the scene with a quick glance. Maggie's calm poise, the watching crowd, Blake's rigid posture. I see, he said. Miss Collins, Maggie supplied. Margaret Collins. Miss Collins, Richard continued. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding. Our clientele typically, well, they understand the exclusivity of our inventory. I understand perfectly, Maggie replied, her voice composed despite the sting in her chest. Your sales manager made the dealership's policies very clear. Blake jumped in again, voice thick with sarcasm. If you're genuinely interested, which I doubt, you're welcome to call for an appointment. But I'd recommend bringing proof of funds and dressing the part. These cars, he gestured broadly around the showroom, are for a certain kind of clientele. A low murmur passed through the onlookers. Someone stifled a laugh. Maggie looked around. The stares, the judgment, the smug expression on Blake's face, the owner's quiet approval. She'd faced discrimination before, but rarely this brazen, this public. I see, she said simply. And with her dignity intact but her spirit bruised, Maggie turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she caught Blake's voice, just loud enough to hear. Some people just don't know their place. The morning sun hit her face as she stepped outside. She didn't pause. She simply pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with quiet purpose. The sting of humiliation lingered, but so did something stronger. A small, steady smile began to form as she made the call. A few miles away, the Collins estate sat nestled on 5 serene acres outside of Boston. Understated, elegant, and quiet, much like its owner. Inside, Alexander Collins looked up from his desk as his wife entered his study. 15 years of marriage had taught him how to read Maggie's expressions, and the one she wore now stopped him mid-sentence. "What happened?" he asked gently, moving toward her. Maggie sank into a chair. The morning's events washed over her again as she recounted everything, the condescension, the cold judgment, the humiliating laughter. Alexander listened in silence, his eyes darkening with every word. "It's not about me," she said finally. "I can walk away from that place and still know who I am, what I've built. But how many others get treated like that every day, and don't have the comfort of knowing they could have easily afforded what they were denied?" Alexander nodded, thoughtful. This was what had always moved him most about Maggie, her fierce compassion, especially when it wasn't about her. "So," he said gently, "what do you want to do about it?" Maggie smiled faintly. "Part of me wants to walk away, buy Caroline's gift somewhere else. But then I think about Daniel, that young salesman who treated me with kindness and respect, no matter how I was dressed. And I think about everyone who's ever been looked down on for not looking the part. People face that kind of judgment every day," Maggie said quietly, locking eyes with Alexander. "And most of them don't have the luxury of walking away, let alone the power to challenge it." Her voice didn't shake, but there was steel beneath it. "These people need to understand that someone's worth isn't measured by their appearance. I'm not looking for revenge," she added gently. "I want awareness." Alexander nodded slowly, something thoughtful flickering behind his calm gaze. A plan was already forming in his mind. "I think I might have an idea that delivers exactly that," he said. "Nothing dramatic," Maggie warned, knowing full well her husband's protective streak. "No swooping in and buying the dealership just to fire everyone." Alexander let out a warm laugh. "Nothing quite so overdone," he said with a wink. "But maybe a little education is in order." Together they began to shape a plan, not rooted in vengeance, but in enlightenment. Not to humiliate, but to open eyes, to shift a perspective that had stayed too comfortably closed for too long. When the details were in place, Alexander turned to her. "Are you sure you don't want to come with me?" Maggie smiled softly and shook her head. "This isn't about me needing to see them brought down. It's about them learning to look deeper, to actually see people." Then, after a pause, she added with a glint in her eye, "But I do expect a full report." That evening, as twilight settled over their peaceful estate, Alexander made a few calls, quiet, deliberate ones. Wheels were set in motion. The next day, the people at Boston Luxury Motors would be met not with anger, but with a lesson, one they weren't likely to forget. The morning dawned bright and flawless, the kind of day that made even city pavement feel golden. Blake Thompson strode into Boston Luxury Motors with the confidence of a man who believed he ran the world, or at least this showroom. He adjusted his trademark blue tie, already reliving the story he'd told over cocktails the night before about that woman who dared to waste his time. Another dreamer, another nobody. Inside, the gleaming showroom was as pristine as ever. Sleek, exotic cars stood under artfully arranged lighting, each positioned like a sculpture. Blake had just wrapped up the morning team meeting, hammering home his usual refrain. "Remember," he said, voice firm, "we deal with a very specific clientele. This isn't about snobbery, it's about efficiency. Qualify your prospects." Daniel, the junior salesman who had watched the previous day's scene with discomfort, said nothing. Blake made a mental note to coach him later on professional judgment. At exactly 10:17 a.m., a sound sliced through the quiet, the unmistakable purr of a finely tuned engine. Heads turned. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Even Blake, who was rarely impressed anymore, felt a jolt of anticipation as the car came into view. It wasn't just any vehicle. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, extended wheelbase. But not just any Phantom. This one shimmered in a custom midnight blue that seemed to shift with the light, as though the car itself had a secret. Estimated value? North of $1.2 million. Is that? Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, stepped out of his office, drawn by the hush. Blake was already moving toward the entrance. "That's the bespoke Phantom," he said, nearly breathless. A chauffeur in crisp uniform and white gloves stepped out and opened the rear door with flawless precision. And then he appeared. The man who emerged carried an air that demanded attention, not through flash, but presence. Tall, composed, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke in soft tones of wealth, not brash declarations. His salt and pepper hair was neatly styled, and his every movement was deliberate and unhurried. Blake's instincts kicked in hard. This wasn't just a potential customer, this was the client, the kind dealerships dreamed of, the kind who didn't just buy once, but built relationships worth millions. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors," Blake greeted him quickly, blocking the path of any competing salesperson. "Blake Thompson, sales manager. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us today." The man paused, offering a firm handshake and a polite, but distant, smile. "Alexander Collins," he said, simply. Blake blinked. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't place it. No matter, his car spoke for itself. "Mr. Collins, it's an absolute honor. What brings you to our showroom today? Perhaps I could interest you in our newest limited—" Alexander raised a hand, cutting him off with practiced ease. "I'm here about a specific vehicle, the Azure Coupe, midnight blue." Blake beamed. "Excellent taste, sir. That model is one of only 15 made this year. I'd be delighted to show you. It's actually just over." "I know where it is," Alexander said, his voice cool. "My wife was here yesterday. She expressed interest in it." Blake faltered, still smiling, but now visibly puzzled. "Your wife? I don't recall. Perhaps one of our team members assisted her?" Alexander's gaze hardened, his polite mask slipping just slightly. "No, Mr. Thompson, you assisted her. Or rather, you refused to." He paused, letting the silence settle. Then added, "Her name is Margaret Collins." She was wearing jeans and a plain white T-shirt. Alexander continued calmly, eyes steady. "You suggested she might be more comfortable browsing used cars." Blake's face drained of color as the words landed. Behind him, Daniel, the junior salesman, let out a soft gasp. "Mr. Collins, Blake stammered, his usual polish nowhere to be found. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding. We welcome all customers here, of course." Before he could fumble further, Richard Mason approached, his instinct sensing the tension in the air. "Everything all right here, Blake?" he asked, his tone neutral but cautious. Alexander turned toward him. "Mr. Mason, I presume?" "Yes," Richard said, extending a hand. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors." "Thank you," Alexander replied, not returning the handshake. "I was just informing your sales manager that my wife visited your showroom yesterday, interested in purchasing the Azure Coupe as a gift for her sister, but instead of being treated with professionalism, she was dismissed because of her attire." Richard's smile vanished. I was part of that conversation briefly," he admitted, "but I wasn't aware of all the details." "Well," Alexander said evenly. The details include your sales manager making it clear that people who look like her don't belong in an establishment like this. A hush fell over the showroom. Other staff members, curious customers, and salespeople had slowly gathered, drawn by the growing tension. You could have heard a pin drop. "Mr. Collins," Blake began again, desperation seeping into his voice. "If there was any misunderstanding—" "It wasn't," Daniel interrupted suddenly. Every head turned. The young salesman looked surprised by the sound of his own voice, but didn't back down. Mrs. Collins was polite and clear about her interest in the azure. She was dismissed, repeatedly, because of how she was dressed. Blake shot Daniel a glare that could cut steel, but the damage was done. Alexander turned his gaze back to Richard Mason. "You know," he said, voice quiet but commanding, "my wife founded and runs the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. It's been her life's work, long before I met her. She's raised over $50 million for hospitals, schools, and adaptive technology programs." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "Maggie chooses to dress simply, not because she has to, but because she believes modesty keeps her grounded. It helps her stay connected to the families she serves. It's one of the many reasons I love her." Richard had gone pale. "Mr. Collins," he said hurriedly, "please believe me. This is not who we are as a company. This incident is deeply regrettable. We pride ourselves on integrity and respect." "Actions," Alexander interrupted. "Speak louder than mission statements, Mr. Mason." There was another pause before he added, "Now, about the azure. I wasn't just looking to purchase one car." Blake's ears perked up. A flicker of hope returned to his eyes. "I intended to buy the azure for my wife's sister," Alexander continued, "as Maggie planned to, but I'm also in the market for a full fleet replacement for our corporate vehicles, 7 in total. And I've been considering a few additions to my personal collection." Richard's eyes widened. A sale of that magnitude would shatter their quarterly targets. "However," Alexander said, letting the word linger, "after what happened, I have to wonder, is this the right place to make such an investment?" The silence was thick. "Mr. Collins," Richard began again, visibly rattled, "please, let us make this right. I'm truly sorry. This does not reflect how we conduct business. We'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Alexander studied him for a moment, then said, "There may be a path forward, but it'll take more than selling me a few cars." "Anything," Richard said quickly. "The Collins Foundation is hosting a benefit gala next month," Alexander said. "We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports complex for kids with physical challenges." Then he turned to Blake, who looked like he wished he could disappear into the floor. "I think your presence could be educational." Blake swallowed hard. "Sir?" "Not as a guest," Alexander clarified. "As a volunteer, we need people to assist with setup, help the kids, see firsthand what this work looks like. The work my wife champions every day." The implication was crystal clear. This was no longer about cars. This was about learning what human dignity really looks like. Alexander then turned back to Richard. "Your dealership might also consider a training program on unconscious bias. I know a few excellent consultants." "Absolutely," Richard said immediately. "We would welcome it." "And as for the purchase," Alexander said, finally allowing a smile to break through, "I'd like Daniel to handle the paperwork, starting with the azure." Daniel blinked. "Me? Thank you, sir. I'd be honored." "Good," Alexander nodded. "Let's get started, shall we?" He turned and walked toward Mason's office. As he passed the azure, he paused for a moment, brushing his hand along its sleek body. "My wife," he said softly, "has exceptional taste." Behind him, Blake Thompson stood frozen, His perfectly polished world cracked open. The lesson he'd never expected had arrived, not with fury, but with grace, and it had changed everything. He had revealed his true character, not by how he treated the powerful, but by how he treated those he assumed weren't. 1 month later, the grand ballroom of the Boston Hotel shimmered with life. The Collins Foundation's benefit gala had turned the space into a celebration of hope. Children with disabilities laughed and played, their families mingled with doctors, donors, and guests, each person a thread in a beautiful tapestry of compassion and resilience. Near the entrance stood Blake Thompson, nearly unrecognizable, not in his tailored suit, but in the navy blue uniform of the event staff. He greeted guests, adjusted signage, and gently guided a boy in a wheelchair through the bustling crowd. So much had changed. What began as an obligation, volunteering at the foundation as the price for salvaging his professional reputation, had become something deeper. Day by day, face to face with the strength and spirit of the children he once might have overlooked, something in Blake had shifted. Across the room, Maggie Collins, elegant in a simple blue dress, made her way toward him. Despite knowing who she was now, Blake was still disarmed by her warmth, her utter lack of pretension. "How are you finding the experience, Blake?" she asked gently. He paused, really thinking about it. "Humbling," he said finally. "And necessary." Maggie smiled. "Thomas seems to have taken a shine to you." Blake chuckled, glancing at the boy in the wheelchair nearby. "Yeah, he's been coaching me in adaptive basketball. Apparently I've got terrible form." Maggie laughed. "He's a brutally honest coach." Blake's expression softened. "Mrs. Collins, I know I've apologized formally, but I wanted to say it face to face. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you that day. There's no excuse." "You're right," she said, without malice. "There isn't. But the real question is, what have you learned?" "That real worth has nothing to do with clothes or status or wealth," Blake said slowly. "And that respect should be given until someone proves they don't deserve it, not the other way around." Maggie nodded. "Good lessons. Expensive ones too." Blake gave a rueful smile, no doubt remembering the corporate fleet sale Alexander had walked away from. "Worth every penny," he said quietly. Just then, Alexander Collins joined them, placing a warm hand on his wife's shoulder. "Blake was just sharing some insights," Maggie told him. Alexander nodded. "I've heard you've become quite involved with the adaptive sports program." "Yes, sir. In fact, I've signed up to continue after my volunteer term ends." He hesitated. "And I've been working with Mr. Mason to overhaul how we approach customers at the dealership. No more qualifying based on appearance." "I'm glad to hear that," Alexander said, and then, to Blake's surprise, added, "Which reminds me, that corporate fleet I mentioned, we're still in the market. I'd like you to handle the transaction." Blake blinked. "Me? Thank you, Mr. Collins. I'd be honored." "Daniel speaks highly of your mentorship," Alexander said. "Sounds like you've been doing some real growing." Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Blake watched the Collinses work the room. They weren't flaunting their wealth or status. They were present, genuine, connecting one-on-one with every child, every parent, every guest. He thought back to that day in the showroom when he'd dismissed Maggie based solely on her jeans and white t-shirt. Now he knew better. True worth had nothing to do with designer labels, flashy cars, or impressive titles. It was found in integrity, in compassion, in how you treat someone when you think they can't offer you anything in return. As Blake helped Thomas back into his chair after a photo session, the boy looked up and grinned. "You know what, Mr. Blake? You're pretty cool for a grown-up." Blake smiled wide. "Coming from you, Thomas, that's the best compliment I've had in a long time." And he meant it. We all make snap judgments sometimes, but, as Blake Thompson learned, when we look past the surface, we just might discover extraordinary people and life-changing moments. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe and become part of our community of story lovers. And hey, have you ever been misjudged? Or maybe you made a snap decision you later regretted? Share your experience in the comments below. You never know who your story might inspire. And remember, the true measure of wealth has little to do with your bank balance, and everything to do with how you treat others when no one important is watching. See you in our next story, where another life-changing lesson awaits. Star.